Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just a second. Give us just a minute here. Thank you all for joining us. I just set up the YouTube stream, so this session will be available directly after at youtube.com/Vicon. We also have a full playlist of the other 16 webinars we've done since October. So some of them are panels like this, some of them are integration webinars. We've got different applications, some staff hosted sessions, so definitely check those out. We are super proud to be a gold sponsor of GCMAS again this year. We can't wait to get back to in-person meetings, but are really glad that we can use this virtual platform to connect with you. Thank you so much for making the time. Thank you to our panelists. I'll let Kim do some introductions in a second. This will be a similar format to our other recent webinars. So Dr. Kim Duffy, our Vicon Life Sciences product manager, will be leading our panelists in a discussion on technology and gait analysis. So that will be about 40 minutes. Our Q&A section is open on this platform, and I'll also be checking YouTube. So you can submit throughout the discussion, and we'll get to those at the end. With that being said, our GCMAS breakout room, we're in Zoom room 2. That'll be open right after this session. So if you want to come over and chat with the team, feel free to join us. And I think I will go ahead and pass it over to Kim to get started.
Thanks, Alicia. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many of you joining us today. So as Alicia mentioned, this week is GCMAS, which we're proudly sponsored, and this is sort of a collaboration webinar that we are doing. So today we're going to be discussing how technology has influenced clinical gaits and sports analysis, as well as some future predictions. I'm pleased to be joined by two experts in the field, Dr. Kirsten Tulchin-Francis and Dr. Danilo Catelli. So Dr. Kirsten Tulchin-Francis is the Division Director of Movement Science at Scottish Rite for Children and Assistant Professor of Healthcare Science, Prosthetics and Orthotics Program at UT Southwestern School of Health Professions. She holds a BSc and MS degrees in Biomedical Engineering and a Ph.D. in Kinesiology Biomechanics. Over the last 20 years, Kirsten's research has primarily focused in lower extremity, pediatric orthopedics, sports medicine, and neurology. Welcome, Kirsten. Dr. Danilo Catelli is a postdoctoral fellow in the Human Movement Biomechanics Laboratory at the University of Ottawa, Canada. He received his PhD in biomechanics from the School of Human Kinetics at the University of Ottawa in 2018, and his master's in bioengineering from the University of Sao Paulo in 2010. Dan's research is focused on biomechanical outcomes of pre and early arthritic hips, hip arthroscopy and arthroscopy outcomes, musculoskeletal modeling, and sports biomechanics. He has recently been working on two different projects, one that uses wearable technology to monitor physical activity, intensity, and bone impact loading in children predisposed to develop femoral tubular, I probably said that wrong, impingement, and another that assesses gait kinematics in arthritic hips to characterize axial mobility. So welcome both. Just to say before we get started, as Alicia mentioned, I'm going to be asking questions to both Kirsten and Dan. So if you do have any questions you want to ask in the group, feel free to submit in the Q&A section, and I'll either ask them during this session or at the end of the session. So to get started, Kirsten, you and the team at Scottish Rite Children's are presenting quite a few research papers today and tomorrow at GCMAS. Would you like to share us what some of those research you are going to be presenting at GCMAS this week?
Sure. So we have a number of projects this year, and they kind of range over a wide variety of topics. I'm going to give you a few highlights. The first one, we kind of took a little bit of advantage, and this doesn't actually involve motion capture, but when life feeds you lemons, you take advantage, right? So we took advantage of a little bit a thing you might have heard of it called COVID. We recognized that we weren't going to be able to do a little bit of research for a while, so we passed out some stepwatch activity monitors to some kids while we were shut down, and we did some research on that and wanted to see how their activity levels had changed. And that was a small study that we did that I'll be presenting later today. But the majority of what we are presenting is actually some research that we got to really do while we were shut down. That was one thing that we took advantage of, while we had a little bit of downtime, right? So we processed some data. So we've got projects that are on sports medicine. So we have been doing a lot of work looking at the changes of task variation on the impact of kinematics. So I think that there's a lot of research that's been done in sports medicine on, for example, drop vertical jumps. And there's lots of people that have looked at drop vertical jumps in a lot of different patient populations. However, if you look into literature, there's not a lot of description about how those drop vertical jumps are performed. So are they done at with the box put at half the patient's height away from the force plates, a third of the patient's height? Are they told to jump? Are they told to pop off the box? Are they told to just step off the box? So we looked at variations in how that task is performed and what impact that task variation had on kinematics. The kinematics, particularly at the knee, in the landing, the first landing of the drop vertical jump. So we have that task variation on the drop vertical jump. We have another one looking at the step down tap. So these are our steps and these are projects that we're doing as part of a multi-center group with pediatric research in sports medicine with PRISM Society, Motion Analysis Research Interest Group, RIG. It's a small group of us that are trying to standardize some of these practices in pediatric research in sports medicine. And so this is a collaborative group that we're doing. So those are a couple of the projects that we're trying to standardize some of these practices so that we can start to do some multi-center research to maybe get a little bit more impactful research in terms of pediatric injury and in pediatric research and injury prevention and ECL outcomes, things like that. So little tidbits that maybe if you're part of GCMAS this today and tomorrow, you can check those out.
They all sound really interesting. So Dan, what are the most interesting current trends in clinical gait analysis or sports biomechanics you feel right now?
I think there's a good trend now in going and using wearables and trying, as Kirsten mentioned, that she took a chance as COVID during COVID, and so did us to collect data out in the field. So that's trying to move a little bit away from the lab and going outside and seeing how the people move outside of the lab in that condition. It's a challenging task to do because we need all the validation behind, right? So how do we know that the data that we're collecting in the field, it's really good data and it's comparable to the data that we collect in the lab? So the trending, I think, is trying to move a little bit away from the lab, but still trying to collect good data and being reliable.
How about you, Kirsten? Can you extend on from that?
I think that Dan's got a really good point. I think that the current trend is to somehow integrate what we do in the lab with what people do outside the lab. And I think that has been a really important factor in the clinical realm that we've been working on for a while. But I think that that's really the focus of the future is how do what we measure inside the lab relate to what they're doing out there? And I think, you know, everybody has the ability to like download an app from their favorite, you know, Play Store or App Store. But I think as researchers, what's really important is we need to make sure that the information that's being gathered is got the best resolution and is research quality if we're going to use it for outcomes, right? So, you know, there's nothing wrong with those apps as long as the data is interpreted in the right way, right? And that information has its place, and that could be informative on a personal level. It could be informative, you know, for my own sake. I might like to know how many steps I take, but it needs to be interpreted in a way that we understand what it's representing and what its error is. And as long as we understand that and we're not using it in the wrong way, right? And so I think that's where we need to go is, as researchers, we need to know these are the tools that we need to use from the research standpoint. These are the tools we need to use from the clinical outcomes standpoint. And these are the tools that can be used commercially for, you know, people's everyday lives, right? Those are three very different realms, I think, and clearly differentiating those and making that well established is very important.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting that you both talked about getting away from the lab, and you're already starting to do that sort of research. Do you feel like that is where we're heading, that more monitoring out in the real world is where we need to go from a clinical analysis standpoint?
Yeah, I feel like data is, you know, everyone, most of all the people have a wearable now, either be a watch or a phone or, you know, even IMUs, people are having like personal IMUs right now. So that is out there. The thing is like exactly how Kirsten mentioned, how do we filter that? You know, so from my watch, how many steps do I get when I'm sitting on my desk working? You know, so there's two errors there. You know, how we select, oh, this is a step, this is a quality step done, and the filtering out of this information that is given to us is super important. There are enormous applications now with people using AI or machine learning just to, you know, trying to identify patterns, identifying tasks that you do during the day using a predefined wearable. But how does that gives back to us? It's super interesting because like every time I'm raking my leaves or shoveling snow, my watch thinks that I'm dancing, you know, or swimming. So it's like, oh, we don't have that option to qualify in the software or the app, but filtering that information it's really, really important. And I feel like, of course, like more you are, if you're in the lab, you have that 1-2 hour sections to collect data and that's it. But trying to understand your patient, how they move, you know, in the outside, in the field, or especially kids when they're playing, when they're doing their regular activities, understanding how they move, that's what the clinicians want to see.
Yeah, because I guess with that sort of monitoring, it's probably good for you as clinicians to understand what they're doing. So it helps from a prescription point of view, I guess, during rehabilitation. Say if you've got a child with an ACL or some sort of movement, that ensuring A, are they doing what they say they're doing, or B, are they doing more than they should be, and things like that. So you get a better perception, like hopefully you get a better treatment outcome at the end of it if you've got more information to utilize.
Yeah.
I think to me that there's never going to be a time for me, though, at least not in my foreseeable future, though, where I see outside the lab completely replacing the lab. Because to me, what the lab does is it gives me the controlled environment where I can control everything and get an understanding of the biomechanics of specific things. So, you know, in the gameplay, I can't control everything. So there's too many factors, there's too many unknowns. But in the lab setting, I can control certain things so that I can get at certain questions. I can look at specific factors. And then I can take that and then can relate it out to what I can capture in the field. So I still think that there's a place for both. And I'm not at the point yet. I'm not at the point yet. I don't see it in my future yet where I'm going to say I'm abandoning the lab.
Yeah.
Don't worry to my staff that's watching. I'm not ready to say that yet. There's still a point where the lab is very important. And to me, connecting the lab, and especially where I can challenge somebody in the lab and maybe take them a little bit more outside of their comfort zone in the lab, you know, not only say, okay, walk, okay, do this drop, vertical jump, but maybe challenge them a little bit outside of their comfort zone, but in a safe and controlled environment in the lab, and then say, okay, now go out and take it outside the lab and do it in your own environment, and then I can correlate it back. And, you know, one other thing, if I can maybe go out on a little bit of a tangent, is the other thing that I like to do is also bring in a little bit of like patient-reported outcome, mental health measurements as well, especially when we're looking more, maybe not in the sport, some in the sports world too, but looking especially for outcomes research. And to see how someone's recovering from an injury, how their activity levels are. You know, I can see how someone's biomechanics are in the lab, and then I can say, how is this relating to their activity level in the community? But I still need to know what their mental health is, because depression, anxiety, and everything else ties into that too. So there's still a role for that as well. And I always want to bring that as a point too, to make sure that you get and capture that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Because we're talking about the lab, I'm going to move on to our next question. And Kirsten, can you tell us the type of technology that you're using in your lab to capture data? So do you use motion capture, IMUs, force plates, for example?
Sure. So we have a Vicon system, obviously. So we have two labs. We have two campuses at our hospital. So I work at a pediatric hospital, pediatric orthopedic hospital. But we have two campuses. One focuses specifically more in sports medicine. So we have a much larger lab there. So we have motion capture. We have force plates, and in our sports lab, we do have a force plate pit where we can move our force plates around on a rail system, which is nice because we can move them if we need to. We do have an IMU system that we can use as well in both campuses. We also have EMG, but we also do collect some strength data if we need to. We also have the capability to do oxygen consumption, portable oxygen consumption if we need to. So we try to get a full capture of everything if we can, kind of attitude, but we do it as needed, obviously, with each question. So, and then we do have some, you know, we'll send accelerometers, wearable sensors home with patients for activity capturing, activity monitoring if necessary as well.
How about you, Dan, at University of Ottawa?
Sure. Yeah. So the head of the lab is Professor Lamont, who's actually in attendance today. So thank you, Mary, for joining us. So the lab is at the university. We have, of course, a motion capture system from Vicon. We actually have two, one side by side from different purposes. We have force plates, EMG system that usually we integrate together when we do data collections. We have isometric and isokinetic machines, as well as the IMUs that we've been using a lot recently, especially for some of the research we're doing in and outside the lab. And when we collaborate, some of the research we do, we also collaborate with the orthopedic department at the hospital. So then we can get advantages of using some imaging machines as well. So, you know, MRI, CT scan, X-rays. So this goes on when we do some of the research.
That's great. And Dan, are there any best practices that you would recommend to other labs that are trying to use these technologies for clinical gait and sports?
Yeah, sure. I think like to get this question, Kristen and I, we could stay here talking like a lot. We actually have a pilot that we did a couple of years ago, where there was like Scottish Rite Hospital in Dallas, HSS, Boston University, Washington, you in St. Louis, and ourselves, we got along together trying to see how good we would collect the data if we had all the 5 sites training exact same protocol to do motion capture. So we flew into Dallas, we trained all the people together, and we test exact same participants in Dallas with the same cameras and same staff processing data. And still the data was not, the same for the same subject. We should have a little bit of fluctuation in the data. So of course, standardization of protocol, it's a key point. So we could see that, a person that places a marker on a participant can totally affect the data, the outcome of the data. So having training, a good training, and then trying to standardize your protocol as much as you can, that's gonna bring you, like more closer to what you want to look at or compare data, right?
How about you, Kirsten?
From my standpoint, Scottish Rite is, we are a CMLA accredited lab. And, I know that the accreditation process is a very daunting undertaking. And while I'm certainly not recommending that every lab has to go through that process, I honestly would recommend that labs at least look at the documentation that's required, because like Danilo said, having really strong written, and that's the key here, written documentation of your practices and your quality assurance is important. How to process your data. How often do you do quality checks of, that check what the delay between your force plates and your motion capture system are? How often do you check the delay between your EMG and your motion capture system? How often do you check the consistency of marker placement within the staff of your lab? Those are the type, what is the training mechanism of your staff, especially if you're an academic institution that has high turnover of students? Who puts the markers on? How are they trained? What is the process of assuring that they know what they're doing? That documentation needs to be written. It needs to be followed. And that was key for me. And, that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to go through the CMLA process. And it was, we found things when we went through that process that I was like, wow, I did not realize how we really needed to do this. And it was a really great exercise for our lab to go through. And we've made some really great practices by going through that process. So I would say that's the best thing I could recommend, is to just put those standard operating procedures in place.
Yeah, that's really good. And typically, how often do you go through those standard operation practices, like reviewing your system, making sure that's okay, making sure your force plates are accurate? How often, how regular would you do that sort of process?
So our quality assurance program is very detailed, and it depends on which test it is. There are some things that we do, some calibration procedures, obviously we do every day, some before every test. Some of them we do once a month, some of them we do every 6 months. Just kind of depends on the test. So most of them we do, I would say, once every 1 to 2 months. We will do checks on the delays between systems for synchronization. We do EMG checks every 1 to 2 months. And then consistency among staff is an annual assessment that we do, where we all put markers on the same person. We do repeatability with each staff member. I mean, and we're talking, this is not a high turnover place. We're talking full-time staff in a clinical lab. We're still checking that annually. Yeah. So absolutely.
Yeah, no, I think that's one thing, like even working for Vicon, we always recommend users doing, like, check your equipment, check your trainers, like ensure you're not introducing errors and your setup is correct every time you capture data, and how important it is to ensure it's properly calibrated and synced and everything. So that's a really good point. So speaking of, we've talked about the benefits and recommendations of current technology to capture. What are still some of the limitations that you both are facing when trying to capture your desired data?
Sure. So of course, it's still very challenging to say, although I would consider motion capture we do in the lab like a good gold standard of how people are moving. Of course, you have other technologies out there as dual fluoroscopy, for example, where you can make sure where exactly your bone is. The thing is that limits the space and even the tasks that you can collect in a lab. So of course, that movement artifact of the markers, it's one thing that we try to control. So in our participants, for example, there's one study specifically where we place the markers on when the participant goes for a CT scan. So it's before surgery, the participant must do a CT scan. We go there and that pre-scan, we go and place the marker and make sure the marker is the exact spot that we want for the pelvis and the knees. And then from there, the participant goes with the marker to the lab and then we collect data there. So this is one thing that we try to control to. It's still like, it's not certain that how the marker will move compared to the bone when they're doing their tasks. And for the IMU, there's some challenges that we face. There was one study that we started, and we wanted to actually collect kinematics of the participants during the day, and then there's still the drift correction that we must control. When we're talking about hours of protocol, that becomes very, very challenging. So while you collect like in a few minutes, you're fine. When you extend that period of time, then that becomes a bit challenging. And also like to guarantee that the kinematics you're getting out of the IMUs, it's another thing. So what is the reliability with that compared to what you collect in the lab? So that's why we try to combine the two in the lab and just to compare and see how it goes. Procedures for dynamic and static calibrations. So those vary a lot, how you make sure that, you're doing a good refined calibration to have a good data when you're actually collecting the data set. So these are some of the challenges we're still finding today to solve. But we can see that, like how things moved in the past. If we say 5-10 years, there was a lot of advancements already. I remember when I started doing my PhD, labeling data, it was just a nightmare. It would, and there were so many options and ways to do it that if you get the exact same task and label yourself in, today and tomorrow, they probably wouldn't give exact same kinematics at the end. And now you have, a bit more advanced ways of, doing your labeling and standardize those things that make things a bit easier.
Yeah, Kirsten, do you have anything to add there?
I'm just chuckling because I'm thinking back what labeling used to look like when I was a student. No, I'm just kidding. with my 1-inch ping pong ball markers and no, there's been so much advancement in the mocap area. I agree. Like that's certainly not like where my hiccups are at this point either. I mean, I think I share a lot of the same thoughts as you with trying to still understand how we're really gathering the IMU data. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all and get it all, take it all in, if you will, and get through it all. Like you said, the very long data captures with it, and understanding really how we're defining everything. I feel like I've dealt with the complex patients of motion capture in the clinical world, the children with cerebral palsy who can't, have complex deformity, and to go over to the sports world where we're used to seeing papers where they've defined the standing position as 0, and which is very common with IMU sensors. And, to go from those two worlds, and I have a hard time flipping back and forth. And going to that technology switch, that's a big change for me. So it's more of a maybe not necessarily a technology limitation as much as a change in assumptions. And, you know, if you want to call that a technology limitation, maybe, but it's just dealing with a new technology and dealing with a new set of assumptions. And it's a change in mindset and how we're applying that technology. So to me, it's just, that's the reality that I'm at this point. So I'm making that jump. So we're still working through that in our lab. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you talk about mindset there, Kirsten, in terms of you have to go, IMUs are different to optical. And as you both said, you can't approach them the same way, you know, in terms of orientation, placement, and how you define it. But what's quite interesting is, do you see that other researchers and other clinicians that are using IMUs, do you feel that they are trying to look at it as typical motion capture, so like optical, and using these same assumptions, and that maybe there's a misconception there in terms of the technologies are the same, but not quite the same, if that makes sense?
I've seen it presented that way. Like I've seen presentations where people have presented data in the same way that it's been presented as the gold standard of motion capture in 3D motion, optical motion capture. And they've tried to do the comparison, and it hasn't gone well in that particular presentation. I'm not saying that I'm not saying they can't be related, but I've seen presentations that have gone awry. And when I see that, it makes me cringe, because to the wrong audience, that it can be construed in a very negative way in either direction. Either they're presenting very erroneous data that is wrong and it can be misconstrued, or to the flip side, they see it as IMUs are no good and we should never use them. So you have two very conflicting sides of it, right? Like someone who doesn't understand the data is getting erroneous data to the side of, oh, IMUs are no good. But we have to come together and find a way to use both of them, because they both have very great value in what we want to do. You know, motion capture in the lab has a great place. IMUs in the field could be our future. We have to find the way to merge them together, but we have to do it in the right way. And using the same methods and the same assumptions are not necessarily the same way to do it. So that's going to be the trick, is bringing them together. And there's people who have done it. We just need to do it in our clinical world now, right? Like, so, yeah.
Do you see that going more clinical, like especially wearables and everything? We know that they're rising. Do you feel like clinicians are now at the stage that they can start adopting this technology and using it more, or do you feel like it's still going to be heavily optical driven for the foreseeable future?
Well, I feel like it's very usable. I couldn't say better than Kristen. You know, like you get different data, you get a longer data. Of course, like if you have a chance to have a biomechanics lab in a hospital or associated with one, just go for it, because you know the data that you're getting, it's it's unique, and it'll be way, for now, a bit more precise than the IMUs. However, when you're out of the field, the IMU data that you get will give you, again, a way more data, way more descriptive. And there's some ways of going around, right? So we've tested a little bit the STAP app from the iMeasure use. And so far they're working well, you know, like they give you, like for the step, the intensity of that step estimates a little bit the bone stimulus that's given for every single step that you do. And because there are two sensors, one on each ankle, you actually know that, you know, a step or a jump or something similar that is classified as a step, it's happening there. So it's, you know, I think we're moving towards, getting a bit more consensus. And as Kristen said perfectly, like the data is different. The way you interpret the data is a bit different. So the way the concepts of the data you're getting out there could be very interesting for clinicians, for sure.
Yeah, no, that's really good points. Just to kind of go off before we go back into the future stuff, because I feel like we're going to have some really good conversation here, but we can't, I guess, not think about the elephant in the room. Like, we're all virtual right now because of the pandemic and COVID. And Kirsten, you talked about, and also Danilo, that how the COVID was to a certain extent a benefit to be able to get some research out that you might not have been able to get as much of if the pandemic had happened. But we talked before this call about new techniques and things that you've had to adopt since then. Has there been any positives or things that you're going to continue as the pandemic subsides, or are you hoping to kind of go back to the old way of capturing and take that forward?
We did some major changes to, how we turn the lab over between patients, and those were all for the better, right? I mean, that's for sure. I think that for the most part, COVID, I think, has just opened our eyes to, how we've done everything in our lab in terms of patient safety. I think for the most part, though, I'm pretty proud that we did a pretty darn good job. I did a survey through GCMAS early in the pandemic. GCMAS, we did a survey of labs all across the US and there were a bunch of labs across the US and a couple around the world about what our cleaning survey, kind of cleaning techniques and protocols. And I was actually a lot of people were saying they weren't going to make a lot of changes because most of the cleaning procedures were already in place. So for that standpoint, I was glad to see that. It takes a little bit more time. We were a little bit more thorough. We got more markers. We got more of everything, right? We just switch everything out and make sure everything sits out longer and stays cleaner. But the biggest thing for us was we were doing some team testing before the pandemic, where we were bringing in kids in a team setting into the lab. And we were doing them in stations where we would have 6 kids in the lab at once.
Wow.
Actually 6 to 8 kids in the lab at once, where we'd have like 2 in the station over here doing strength and sprints, 2 over here doing Y balance testing and, range of motion, and then 2 in the motion capture volume at once, which was really cool, by the way, to do, having 2 kids markered up in the motion capture volume at one time, doing drop vertical jumps and everything. But I'm happy to say we're about to get back to that. The bottom line is these kids practice together, they train together, they're together all the time anyway. So we're going to go back to it. Now we're going to try to limit the kids in the lab in the other station. So instead of doing 6 to 8 kids, we're probably going to do them in groups of 4. But we're gonna carry on. These kids are already together 10 hours a week training. So we're going to keep going. But we've been on pause, so we're going to start this summer. But yeah. But we've been open since September, so.
Yeah, that's very different to a lot of places, as we were talking before, how different we are depending on where we are. Dan, how about you in terms of University of Ottawa?
Yeah, we did collect some data last year, but again, all the cleaning protocol that was put in place limited us on the amount of participants that we could collect data. So we're actually, when we were open, because we're closed right now, we would have participants like 1 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon only. It should give us, of course, we don't have the same staff that Kirsten has at a hospital, but just to control us and give us time to put all the cleaning protocols in place. But one study that I mentioned before was collecting inertial data in children. So just before COVID, we're budgeting for the grants, how we would proceed with the protocol to collect the data in the field with children. In our minds, we had a setup like, okay, so we must need like a research assistant to the children's house in the morning. They'll set it up, the probes. The kids go for the day, and then the next day in the morning we go and swap the probes. And start data collections, recharge, and that completely changed. And then we said, okay, like how confident we are about training parents, So we create like a video protocol, like, okay, we're gonna teach parents how to put the probes on, let's see what we can get out of there. Like, we can bring children in the lab. So if this is the only thing we can do, let's go for it. you know. So instead of like needing a research assistant every single day to go and swap probes to collect data, you know, for a full week, for example, we had the parents trained to use, to place the probes and do the data collections themselves. And that went surprisingly really well. We did have some challenges with some of the parents that were not so comfortable with technology, but others, they were fully confident, and then they did well, you know. The thing is, controlling the placement with photos every single day, you know, being from the outside, it's not a thing that you can, okay, make sure that, you know, same researcher place the probes in every single chip. That won't be the case anymore. But that's something that we found that probably will be moving towards that way, you know, improving the quality of the training for the parents, because I mean, it's placing an IMU on the ankle. So of course, things could go wrong if you place upside down or the other side of the ankle. But if you get on the standardization and train it well, try to control, probably that's how we're moving for this study right now. So keeping that way.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you both. So we spoke a lot about IMUs and that rise, and I think like we've covered that quite well. How about markerless? We're seeing more, obviously Vicon are partnering with Fair markerless. We are seeing that rise in people wanting to use markerless, even from a clinical and sports biomechanics perspective. What are your thoughts on markerless in terms of that evolution? Would you embrace it? Do you think it's not quite there at the minute? Or yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting thing to see, and especially the new partnership with Thea right now from Vicon. That's super interesting, especially to compose the two and see how variable it is. I don't think it's quite there yet. You know, I feel like 3-4 years ago when you saw on YouTube, you know, a 2D marker from any video that you put online and start seeing, you know, tracking up the knees and the shoulders, the head, it was quite impressive to see. And of course, like when you think and research, oh, can we translate that to 3D? What we can get out of that there? When you see a full markerless working right now, I'm not an expert. We don't use that in a lab, but I feel like that's pretty trendy. I think that's how we are moving towards. And if we have a standardization again for this type of protocol, that perhaps will eliminate, you know, some researcher placing markers that we also saw that it's not perfect, you know. So if we can get like a software to do that, probably that will help a lot. Still, the data, when we see videos even promoting it, you can see, you know, there's a little tweaks here and there for pelvis, for knees. It's not perfect yet, but I think we're moving towards that direction for sure.
Yeah. How about you, Kirsten? Do you feel like you'd embrace markerless in your future?
I think I'm with Dan on this. I think that, you know, I think it's interesting, and I think it's got a little bit of work to go, but I'm not against it. I don't know enough about it. We haven't used it at all in our lab yet. But you know, I like to keep an open mind, you know. Like we said, I think as long as we understand what the accuracy and the resolution and understand all the assumptions that go into it, I'm always open for new technology that can make our data collection easier and make it easier for the kids. That's always great. Anything that can make our jobs easier will be great.
Yeah. So we're getting into the final two questions, and then I'm going to open it up to the group. And the first one is, what are your predictions for the future in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of technology?
Yeah, I feel like once we have inertial data, thinking about like 5-10 years from now, once we have like inertial data, very reliable, markerless, very reliable, we're just increasing that amount of data we can collect, right? So once you have good data to work with, the amount of data we'll have will just increase exponentially, and then perhaps we'll see like a jump. You know, we're already seeing a jump in AI and machine learning, as I was saying, but like that's going to be like a good data. If good data goes in, good data comes in, goes out. So of course, I feel like this is where we're moving towards now. Like increasing the number of data. So studies that we have, like how many studies I have published with, not many participants, that will, that's not going to be the case. Or collected data in, we performed 5 squats, and then we're averaging data there and trying to understand those 5 squats. So how many squats can I get, for a week period? How do they do squats when they're doing other things?
Right.
So getting out of that environment. But of course, to get there, to understand that data, we need to validate, compare with a controlled data set, a controlled environment, which is still in the lab. So I think we're moving towards that direction. There's still some homework to get there.
Yeah, how about you, Kirsten?
Yeah, I agree. I think finding a way to really get that hybrid solution between the IMU wearable sensor in the community that they can take home with them, that we can gather long-term information that we can relate back to what we gather in the lab is key. And I do think that we will get there. I think, one of the things you were asking about, like a limitation with the current technology, and like thinking back on that now, the sensors that we currently wear for wearable sensors in the community to wear home right now, like I want something that I can give to them that they can take home with them for, an extended period of time that's not bulky and, some big thing that they have to put on. I want something nice and slim that they can put on underneath, a little nice strip, stick it on their leg, and it's easy to wear. And that's what they need. A sticker, slap this sticker on that they can put on their thigh and that nobody's going to see it. That's what they need. If we can get them that, and they can wear it for a week, then that's ideal. I think we're getting there. I think we are. 10 years. Within 10 years, and then within 15 years, I'll be retired. And then
Then it's someone else's problem.
Then it's somebody else's problem.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Is there anything from like us as industry or technologies that could help further enhance your biomechanics skills, like in terms of data collection? Is there anything that you would love to see to be able to like improve that in terms of like, quickness of data collection, processing, or are you fairly happy with where things currently are within motion capture, for example?
Like I said, if we can get a sticker that they can stick on their thigh and wear out in the field. I mean, even think about on the soccer field. Do you want to gather like full lower extremity kinematics and like full body kinematics with an IMU system? I want something slim and thin that they can put on out on the field. That's unintrusive, that the referee's not going to give us a hard time about, that, that would be great.
Or even markerless.
Yeah.
Like, I mean,
or markerless out on the field.
So you go a soccer field, you put some cameras out, you cross them together, you're collecting 22 players playing at the same time. If that's a reliable data, that's unique. That's
the whole pitch, awesome. Though. I want the whole pitch, though. I want both teams. I want the whole pitch. Yep. And the referees. Yep.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
So you would say it's more a case of being able to expand that functionality outside of the lab as opposed to what technology is currently happening within the lab.
Yeah. I mean, like how much time we lose like placing markers on a participant? We have like, I don't know, 50 markers to place on. You got to be trained. You got to go there, palpate, put the marker on the right spot. Of course, that takes time. Everything that you could, fast forward processes and getting good data out, that's a win.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting and good points. Final question, because in case any of the participants ask, how our listeners are able to reach out to you both if they want to have more information? Are you willing to share your email addresses to the group? If you could just place it in the chat so then everyone can see that, so that if anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. I'm also seeing questions coming in now, so the questions are open up to the group. So we do have one in the chat. Kirsten, I don't know if you did respond. It's hi, my name is Johnson, an assistant professor. I'm creating a biomechanics lab at Ottawa State University. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. Totally understand that the procedure protocol should be documented. I have a question about marker sets. For example, the lower body motion capture, can you share what marker set you use? Plug-in Gait, cluster set, CGM2. I used to use plug-in Gait and try to use CGM2 and want to hear about your experiences, the marker set you have used.
Yeah, well, that's a loaded question. So my response is that it 100% depends on your application, really. I mean, if I'm doing, gait analysis, like a clinical gait analysis in a cerebral palsy patient, and it's a very straightforward, like just lower extremity gait, I might be comfortable with doing, either the plug-in Gait or the CGM2, like marker set, like a very standard lower extremity set. But if I'm going to go with like a sports medicine application and I want to do this in like an ACL, like post-op kid, then I'm going to go with a cluster analysis of the 6 degree of freedom model. So, it really, really depends on what my application is and what my patient population and what my question is. If I'm going to look at a kid that has clubfoot and is 15 or 16-year-old, I'm probably doing a marker set that has a multi-segment foot model. So, there I'm going to be changing it and doing it with a little bit different, right? Like, so it really depends on the question and what your question is and what your kind of variables of interest are, I would say. I mean, Dan, would you agree? It kind of, yeah.
Great. The next one is an IMU one, which Dan, if you can answer. Are there any resources that you'd recommend to learn how to use and process data from IMUs?
Well, there's a bunch out there, and it again depends what you want to get out of the IMUs. So we explored a little bit more than a year ago, getting kinematics out of IMU, so playing with the quaternions and trying to correct the drift, just to get reliable data for a bit longer data collection. And that went so-so. So there's a lot, although there's a lot of research going on, like right now, trying to fix those issues, So there's some systems that they provide a little bit more of kinematics. There are others that provide a little bit more of other variables of interest. So it depends what you want out of the IMUs. Perhaps like if we want to collect kinematics out of 5 consecutive days for a full day long, going with kinematic data, that'll be just too much, like for the drift correction, especially, that would be a super challenge. So that's why we opt to get another system that provides us different types of variables. So it all depends what you want to collect.
Kirsten, is there anything to add to that?
No, not really. I agree completely with what he said. Absolutely.
Yeah, at the same, like you said, there's many different protocols available, open libraries in MATLAB and also Python, but ultimately it comes down to your question. If you want to, I guess, learn more about what other researchers censors the journal, is really good to look at different people's methodology. So maybe worth checking that out as well. Next question, do you use visual feedback with the cameras to rehabilitate patients? If so, which software?
We don't use it for rehab. We don't use it for rehab. We've used a little bit of like real time, like reaction time things, where we've done some real time stuff with that. But where we've done like either MATLAB or LabVIEW, where we've pulled in a live feed of the data into LabVIEW to do a reaction time, like go this way, cut that way kind of thing. But we've never done anything in terms of rehab.
Yeah, neither us. We don't do much of rehab. So giving feedback, it's just like if the position is not right, not exactly as we want in the protocol, for example, then seeing through Nexus, we can see, the position is not right or not quite what we wanted. So it's either the participant or our placement that has an issue there. So the pure using Nexus could give us some idea of what's going on. But not for rehab specifically. So like instructing, that's not something that we do, unfortunately.
Do you think possibly, like say, for example, if technology progresses more in a real-time element with like IMUs, markerless, even optical, you feel like you'd actually bring more of that real-time rehabilitation or data collection into it?
I think so. I think like it will be a combination of both, right? If you're talking about rehab, so you're talking about like a physio being on site and seeing with their own eyes what's going with the movement and trying to measure what's happening on that specific situation. But I feel like I wouldn't know how to point like with specific software to look into because that's not something that I do.
Yeah, I guess ultimately, like Kirsten and Dan have said throughout, it's very much a case of what you're trying to review in real time. There's many different softwares out that can allow that. It's MoTech, Motion Monitor. In terms of doing real time, that connects into Nexus. You can also use MATLAB to an extent, Python, LabVIEW. And then even within an optical environment, for example, within Nexus, you could create a monitor and use like real-time feedback within there and create that feedback. So I guess ultimately it depends on what you're trying to do with that. But if you want to know more about how you could do that within Nexus, please do email us at either my name at vicon.com or support@vicon.com. I'll put that in the chat so people can see that. We don't have any more questions, so I'd just like to say thank you to you both for participating. It's been, I could literally talk about some of these subjects for so much longer, but we've all got to continue and GCMAS is carrying on. So everyone that's going to be at GCMAS, hopefully we can have that conversation. But if you do want to chat to us privately, we do have a breakout room at Vicon, which Alicia has just posted now, which we will be moving to that room. So if you do any questions with me, feel free to reach out there. I'm going to end that here. So thank you so much, Dan and Kirsten. It's been great, and hopefully next time we can do this in person.
Yes.
So enjoy the rest of GCMAS, and I'll see you all soon.